Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 2 of a class book of Old Testament history by G.F. Maclear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. A class book of Old Testament history by G.F. Maclear. Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 2, Athaliah and Joash, Death of Elisha. 2 Kings chapters 6 through 14, 2 Chronicles chapters 22 and 23, BC 894 to 839. Thus, after scenes hitherto unparalleled in the history of the chosen nation, Jehu established himself upon the throne and reigned upwards of 28 years. Those years are almost blank to us. All we know is that though commended for the destruction of Ahab's worthless dynasty, and assured that his descendants to the fourth generation should sit upon the throne, he persisted in walking in the ways of Jeroboam, and retained the old calf worship at Dan and Bethel. But his reign was not a peaceful one. The Lord began to cut Israel short. Hazael attacked his kingdom and ravaged the territories of the tribes east of the Jordan. 2 Kings 10 verse 33. Meanwhile, similar scenes of extermination had been enacted even in the southern kingdom of Judah. On the death of Ahaziah, BC 884, Athaliah, the queen mother, who had probably been entrusted with the royal functions during his absence at Jezreel, resolved to seize the supreme power and for this purpose put to death all the members of the royal house who had not already perished by the sword of Jehu. From the general massacre, Joash, the infant son of Ahaziah, alone escaped, and was concealed by his aunt Jehosheba, wife of Jehoiada, the high priest, in the house of the Lord for the space of 6 years. 2 Chronicles 22 verses 11 and 12. During this period, the usurpation of Athaliah was endured, but in the 7th year, BC 878, her foreign practices having probably disgusted the nation, the high priest deemed it an auspicious moment to bring about a change. Gathering round him all the supporters of the family of David, he placed a large force of priests and Levites in 3 bands at the entrances of the temple, and armed the captains of hundreds with the consecrated spears and shields placed there by David. Then before them, and a number of the people who favoured his design, he brought out the infant Joash, and in the presence of all, publicly crowned and anointed him, and presented him with a copy of the law. The noise of the people reached the ears of the queen mother, and she came into the temple only to see her grandson already placed on a raised throne and invested with regal functions. Jehoiada had given strict orders that she should not be put to death within the sacred enclosure, and crying treason, she was hurried from the ranges and slain at the entrance of the horse gate by the royal palace. 2 Kings 11, verses 4 through 16, 2 Chronicles 23, verses 12 to 15. A covenant was then solemnly ratified between the king, high priest, and people, by which they bound themselves to be faithful to Jehovah, and in proof thereof attacked the temple of Baal which Athaliah had built, slew its attendant priest, Mattan, and broke down the altars and images. During the lifetime of his aged counsellor, the youthful sovereign ruled his kingdom prudently, and was blessed with a large measure of prosperity. In the 23rd year of his reign, he commenced a complete repair of the temple, which had suffered much during the late usurpation. Messengers were dispatched throughout his dominions to levy contributions for the work, which were willingly bestowed both by princes and people. But on the death of the high priest, at the advanced age of 130 years, a change came over the policy and character of the king. At the suggestion of the princes of Judah, the worship of Baal and Ashtaroth was revived, and the service of Jehovah neglected. Prophets were sent to rebuke the king for this apostasy, but their protests were unavailing. One of them, Zechariah, the son of the late high priest, as a penalty for his bold, outspoken honesty, was stoned to death between the holy place and the altar of burnt offering. Matthew 23, verse 35. His last words, "The Lord look upon it and require it," were speedily fulfilled. The year had not ended before the Syrian army commanded by Hazael appeared before Jerusalem. 2 Kings 12, verse 17. It had lately been successful against the Philistine city of Gath, and now, though small in numbers, was able to defeat a large army of Judah, and was only prevailed upon to depart by being permitted to carry away to Damascus all the votive offerings and much of the temple treasures. Nor was Joash destined long to survive this disgrace. Afflicted with a severe illness, probably in consequence of wounds received in the late engagement, he was suddenly attacked by 2 of his servants and slain in his bed in the fortress of Millo, BC 839. 2 Kings 12, verse 20 and 21, 2 Chronicles 24 and verse 26. In addition to their victories over the Philistines, the Syrians under Hazael had been equally successful against the king of Israel, Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, reducing him to such a depth of subjection that he was compelled to limit his army to 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 infantry. After an inglorious reign, he bequeathed his throne to his son Jehoash or Joash, BC 841, who, in spite of the warnings the nation had already received, persisted in practicing idolatry. During his reign, the aged prophet Elisha fell sick, and Jehoash went to his house and wept over him, in the same words that Elisha himself had used when he beheld Elijah carried up into heaven, saying, "O my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof." But other thoughts than the prophet's approaching end filled the hearts of both. Hazael was cutting Israel short and ravaging the country far and near. The aged prophet bade the king open the window eastward towards the hated country and place an arrow on the string of his bow. Then, laying his own hands upon the king's hands, he bade him shoot, and as the shaft sped from the string, he followed it with the prophetic blessing, "The arrow of the Lord's deliverance, and the arrow of deliverance from Syria. Thou shalt smite the Syrians in Aphek till thou hast consumed them." At the prophet's command, the king next took the arrows and smote them on the ground 3 times, and then stayed. But he did it with no spirit or energy, and the victories he might have achieved were limited to 3. 2 Kings 13, verses 14 to 19. Shortly afterwards, Elisha died, but his wonder-working power was not to cease with his life. He had not been long laid in the tomb when marauding bands of the Moabites invaded the land. A dead man was about to be buried in the cemetery which contained the prophet's sepulchre. Seeing the band of spoilers, the mourners hastily thrust the corpse into the receptacle where the prophet lay, and no sooner did it touch his remains than the man revived and stood upon his feet. The victories, however, which Elisha had promised were realized. 3 times was Joash enabled to triumph over the Syrian armies, and recovered the cities which the Israelites had lost in previous wars. 2 Kings 13, verse 25. End of Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 2, recorded by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 3 of a class book of Old Testament history by G.F. Maclear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. A class book of Old Testament history by G.F. Maclear. Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 3. Amaziah and Jeroboam II, Era of Jonah. 2 Kings chapter 14, Jonah chapters 1 through 4, BC 840 to 758. Meanwhile, Amaziah had succeeded to the throne of Judah. His first care after his accession was to punish the murderers of his father, which he did with unusual lenity, sparing their children in accordance with the true spirit of the Mosaic law, Deuteronomy 24 verse 16, Ezekiel 18 verses 4 and 20. His next resolve was to take vengeance on the revolted Edomites, and for this purpose summoned to his standard 300,000 of Judah, and at the rate of 100 silver talents hired 100,000 of Israel. 2 Chronicles 25 verse 6. Warned, however, by a prophet against leading any of the idolatrous Israelites into battle amongst his own forces, he was induced to dismiss his mercenaries, who returned home in great anger. With his own army then he marched against the Edomites, and defeated them with great slaughter in the valley of Salt, south of the Dead Sea, capturing also their rocky fortress capital Petra or Selah, and flinging 10,000 of his captives headlong from their natives' cliffs. But with strange perversity, he now set up in Jerusalem the idols of the very nation he had just subdued, and paid them religious honours. 2 Chronicles 25 verse 14. For this apostasy, a prophet threatened him with speedy vengeance, and misfortunes quickly thickened around him. The Israelite mercenaries, in revenge for the loss of booty they had sustained, on their way homewards ravaged many of the towns of Judah. Smarting under this insult, Amaziah was foolish enough to challenge his rival, the king of Israel, to battle. Joash replied by the contemptuous parable of the thistle and the cedar, and bade Amaziah not provoke a contest. The other, however, would not yield, and the rival armies met at Beth-shemesh, on the borders of Dan and Philistia, and the men of Judah were utterly defeated. Joash even took his rival prisoner, and conveyed him as a captive to Jerusalem, the walls of which he broke down on the side nearest to his own kingdom to the extent of 400 cubits, and after rifling the temple of his treasures and exacting hostages, returned to Samaria. Shortly after this, however, he died, and bequeathed his throne to his son Jeroboam II, BC 825, while Amaziah survived him 15 years, at the close of which period a conspiracy was formed against him, from which he fled to Lachish, where he was assassinated and was succeeded by his son Azariah or Uzziah, BC 810. 2 Kings 14 verses 19 and 20. The reign of Jeroboam II, which lasted 41 years, was the most prosperous the kingdom of Israel had ever known. The new king did not simply content himself with repelling the attacks of the Syrian invaders, but carried the war into their own country, captured their capital Damascus, and recovered all the old dominion of Israel, from Hamath to the Dead Sea, together with the territory of Moab and Ammon. These successes had been predicted, 2 Kings 14 verse 25, by the earliest of the prophets, whose writings as well as words have come down to us, Jonah, the son of Amittai of Gath-hepher of Zebulun. The idolatries, however, of the king called forth the protests of Hosea, a prophet of uncertain tribe and birthplace, Hosea 1 verse 1, and Amos, a herdsman of Tekoa, Amos 1 verse 1. Those of Amos were keenly resented by Amaziah, the high priest of Bethel, Amos 7 verse 10, and he reported him to the king as having predicted the destruction of the royal house and the captivity of the nation, Amos 7 verses 11 to 17, which, though not fulfilled in his reign, were only deferred. Azariah, or Uzziah, the new king of Judah, retained the scepter for upwards of 52 years, and was successful in several warlike expeditions. He subjugated the Philistines, and dismantled Gath and Ashdod, reduced the Arabians and Mehunims to obedience, and recovered Elath, the famous port on the Red Sea. 2 Chronicles 26 verses 2 and 7. He also improved the internal resources of his kingdom, restored the fortifications of Jerusalem, built military engines, and established a powerful army. Moreover, he devoted himself to the encouragement and protection of husbandry, building towers and wells for his numerous herds in the low country and in the plains, and growing vines on the terraces of the mountains. 2 Chronicles 26, 9 to 15. But in the hour of prosperity, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. Assuming priestly functions, he entered the holy place in the temple for the purpose of offering incense on the golden altar. This flagrant violation of the law was resolutely opposed by the high priest Azariah and others of the Levitical body, and drew down upon the king signal punishment. As he stood, censer in hand by the altar, the leprosy rose up in his forehead, and he hurried in alarm from the sacred enclosure. He was now incapable of discharging the regal functions, until the day of his death lived in a separate house, while Jotham, his son, was entrusted with the regency and eventually succeeded him, BC 758. 2 Kings 15 verse 5, 2 Chronicles 26 verses 16 to 22. Meanwhile, the great empire, destined to be the instrument of punishing the apostate kingdom of Israel, was advancing with gigantic strides in the path of universal conquest. Beyond the territory of the Syrians, the scourge of Jehu and his dynasty, was the far more powerful empire of the Assyrians, including the whole region watered by the Tigris and Euphrates, and already augmented by important conquests in Cappadocia, Armenia, and Babylonia. To Nineveh, its celebrated capital, the prophet Jonah, already mentioned, was directed to go and denounce its approaching doom, unless its people repented of their sins. The prophet shrunk from this arduous commission, and instead of crossing the Syrian desert, went down to Joppa, and there took ship for Tarshish, probably Tartessus, on the southern coast of Spain. Jonah 1 and verse 3. But during the voyage, an awful storm arose, and in their alarm the mariners threw him at his own request into the sea, where a large fish took him up, and after 3 days and 3 nights flung him forth alive on the dry land. Matthew 12 verse 40, chapter 16 verse 4, and Luke 11 verse 30. Thus miraculously delivered, he was a second time bidden to undertake the arduous journey, and now not daring to disobey, arose and went. Suddenly appearing in the midst of Nineveh, clothed in his rough prophet's robe, he cried through corridor and lane and square, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." His mysterious words filled the hearts of all with fear and consternation, and before long reached the palace, where the king sat on his royal throne in the great audience chamber, surrounded by all the pomp and magnificence of his court. The words of the unknown prophet touched even his heart, and he arose from his throne and laid aside his robe from him and covered himself with sackcloth and sat in ashes. Jonah 3 and verse 6. Then he proclaimed a decree that all his people, from the greatest even to the least, should be covered with sackcloth, and that even the beasts should be put in mourning. His decree was obeyed, a fast was observed, and the people of Nineveh, laying aside their revelry and feasting, assumed the garb of mourning, humbled themselves, turned from their evil way, and offered up petitions for mercy to the Most High. Their repentance was accepted. God had pity on the great city, with its 120,000 persons that could not discern between their right hand and their left, and deferred the judgment. In vain the prophet sat in his booth of woven boughs at the east side of the city, waiting for the doom he had denounced. In vain he complained of the deferring of the punishment. God was more merciful than man, and for more than another century Nineveh was to stand unharmed. Jonah 4 verses 5 through 11. End of Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 3. Recorded by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 4 of a class book of Old Testament history by G.F. Maclear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. A class book of Old Testament history by G.F. Maclear, Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 4, Decline and Captivity of the Kingdom of Israel. 2 Kings chapters 15 through 17, BC 773 to 721. The death of Jeroboam II, BC 783, was the signal for a frightful state of anarchy in the kingdom of Israel. At length, after an interregnum of 11 years, Zechariah, his son, succeeded to the throne BC 773. His brief reign of 6 months served only to exhibit his addiction to idolatrous practices when he was assassinated by Shallum, and with him the dynasty of Jehu came to an end. The reign of the usurper was briefer still. For 1 month only did he retain the royal power, and then was deposed in his turn by Menahem, the son of Gadi, BC 772. Either at the beginning or at the somewhat later period, during his reign of 10 years, the new king ordered a promiscuous massacre of the inhabitants of the country between Tirzah and Thapsacus, probably for the purpose of inspiring terror into the hearts of many who were unfavourable to his cause. 2 Kings 15, verse 14. A more significant circumstance during his reign was the appearance of the Assyrians on the northeastern frontier of his kingdom. Pul, king of Assyria, having been successful in his expedition against Damascus, advanced also against Israel, and was only induced to draw off his forces by a timely gift of 1,000 talents of silver, which Menahem wrung from his people by an assessment of 50 shekels a head from 60,000 Israelites. 2 Kings 15, verse 20. Menahem died in peace, bequeathing his throne to his son Pekahiah, BC 761, who only reigned for 2 years and was then assassinated in his palace by Pekah, son of Remaliah, a captain of his bodyguard, BC 759. The new king displayed a far greater energy than his immediate predecessors. The enormous tribute levied by the king of Assyria had greatly exhausted the resources of his kingdom. He resolved, by way of compensation, to ally himself with Syria and attack the rival kingdom of Judah. During the vigorous reign of Jotham, he does not seem to have been able to carry out the latter part of this design, but on the death of that monarch and the accession of his weak son Ahaz, BC 742, he advanced against Jerusalem in alliance with Rezin, king of Syria, and took a vast number of captives who were, however, restored by the advice of the prophet Oded. 2 Chronicles 28, 8-15. So far as the Syrians were concerned, the expedition was successful. Rezin captured the port of Elath, drove the Jews out of the place, and settled there a Syrian colony. But in other respects, the unnatural alliance of Israel and Syria was calamitous. In his extremity, Ahaz resolved to seek the assistance of Tiglath-Pileser, the successor of Pul on the Assyrian throne, and for this purpose sent him a large and valuable present from the temple treasures. 2 Kings 16, verse 7. The Assyrian monarch readily embraced the opportunity of crushing the formidable alliance of Syria and Israel. Marching against Damascus, BC 740, he captured the Syrian capital, slew Rezin, and carried off his subjects to Kir. 2 Kings 15, verse 29. Then turning his arms still further westward, he fell upon the northern towns in Pekah's dominions, Ijon, Abel-Beth-Maachah, Hazor, and others, and carried off the inhabitants to remote districts within his own dominions. Pekah was now reduced to the position of a humble vassal of the great lord of Assyria, and was obliged to abstain from any further hostilities against Ahaz. But that king had purchased this temporary relief at a great cost. Not only was he obliged to yield up the temple treasures as tribute to Tiglath-Pileser, but he had to appear also in person at Damascus as a vassal of that monarch, and did homage to his protector and even to his protector's gods. Because, said he, the gods of the kings of Syria help them, therefore I will sacrifice to them, that they may help me. And he not merely conformed to heathen rites, but actually sent to Urijah, the high priest at Jerusalem, the pattern of an altar he had seen in the Syrian capital, and desired that another should be made like it. The high priest obeyed, and the idolatrous altar was placed within the sacred precincts of the temple, and the king himself offered sacrifice thereon. Moreover, every city in the dominion shared in the idolatries of the capital. Everywhere Ahaz made high places to burn incense to other gods, introducing the worst superstitions of the remotest east, practicing necromancy and witchcraft, Isaiah 8 verse 19, causing his children to pass through the fire in the valley of Hinnom to Moloch, 2 Kings 16 verse 3, dedicating sacred horses to the sun and raising altars on the housetops for the worship of the heavenly bodies, 2 Kings 23:12, 2 Chronicles 28 verses 2 to 4. While the southern kingdom thus seemed bent on rivaling that of Israel in idolatrous excesses, the fortunes of the latter kingdom had become more and more gloomy. After a reign of 20 years, Pekah was assassinated, BC 737, by Hoshea, the son of Elah, who, after several years of anarchy, was strong enough to secure the scepter for himself, BC 730. His reign, indeed, was not so sinful as that of his predecessors, 2 Kings 17 verse 2, but the doom of Israel was nigh at hand. He had been on the throne but a few years when Shalmaneser, the successor of Tiglath-Pileser, invaded his territory and reduced Israel to vassalage. This induced Hoshea to open a secret correspondence with Sosabeko I, king of Egypt. But news of his defection reaching the ears of the Assyrian monarch, he summoned Hoshea to Damascus to explain his conduct, and there placed him in prison. Then, mustering his forces, he invaded his territory and laid siege to Samaria, BC 723. Its natural strength enabled that city to hold out for 3 years, during which period Shalmaneser appears to have been obliged to return to Damascus in consequence of a successful revolt headed by Sargon, to whom he forfeited his crown. But this change brought no respite to the beleaguered capital of Israel. After a protracted resistance, it was captured, BC 721, and thus Sargon completed the conquest which Shalmaneser had begun. Vast numbers of the remaining tribes were now removed into captivity and located partly in Gozan or Migdonia and partly in the cities lately taken from the Medes. Their place was filled by a foreign population from the more inland districts of the empire, and colonies from Cuthah, Hamath and Sepharvaim possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities of Israel, whose existence as an independent kingdom now came to an end forever. End of Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 4 of A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear, recorded by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 5 of A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear, Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 5, Reign of Hezekiah, 2 Kings chapters 18 to 20, 2 Chronicles chapters 24 to 32, BC 726 to 698. While the kingdom of Israel thus came to an end, that of Judah seemed to have taken a fresh lease of vitality. At the close of the wicked reign of Ahaz, his son Hezekiah succeeded to the throne BC 726 and proved to be one of the best of the monarchs of the line of David. His first act after his accession was to set on foot a thorough religious reformation. He removed the high places, broke down the images, and even destroyed the brazen serpent, the ancient relic of the wanderings, which had become an object of idolatrous worship under the name of Nehushtan, 2 Kings 18 verse 4. He then cleansed and purified the temple and reopened it with splendid sacrifices conducted by the reinstated priests and Levites, 2 Chronicles 24 verses 20 to 36, and resolved to celebrate a peculiar Passover and invite to it all throughout the land of Palestine who bore the Hebrew name, 2 Chronicles 30 verses 1 through 10. To this end he dispatched messengers throughout Judah and northwards through Ephraim and Manasseh as far as Zebulun. The remnant of the once powerful house of Joseph treated his invitation with scorn, but all Judah and many of the smaller tribes assembled at Jerusalem and took part in the great national rite, which was celebrated at an unusual but not an illegal period and lasted upwards of 14 days. The associations awakened by this ancient ordinance roused the people to a becoming zeal for the true God, and on their return from Jerusalem, a general destruction of idolatrous images and temples was set on foot throughout Judah and Benjamin, and even some portions of the northern kingdom. 2 Chronicles 31, verse 1. Seconded in his pious efforts by the noble-minded prophet Isaiah, the king proceeded to carry out other religious reforms and was rewarded for his zeal by a large measure of prosperity. Venturing to assume the offensive against the Philistines, he not only recovered the territory which his father had lost, but gained other important advantages. 2 Kings 18 verses 7 and 8. This success emboldened him to throw off the Assyrian yoke and to decline forwarding the usual tribute. The late capture of Samaria by the Assyrians would render probable a speedy vengeance for this defection. But the wealthy city of Tyre, now the head of the Phoenician kingdom, was first to feel the weight of the Assyrian arms, and its inhabitants made such a stubborn resistance that after operations extending over 5 years, the design was given up as impracticable. The time thus gained was not thrown away by Hezekiah. He used every effort to strengthen his capital against the expected invasion, repaired the walls, built towers, set captains over the host, stopped up the wells, diverted the watercourses, 2 Chronicles 32 verses 3 and 4, forged weapons of war, and while most of his people trembled at the certain coming of the great Assyrian conqueror, and many of his advisers would have made an alliance with Egypt, the monarch was exhorted by Isaiah not to lose his confidence in God. At length, in the 14th year of his reign, 2 Kings 18 verse 13, the invader appeared. Sennacherib, the successor of Sargon, came up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. 2 Kings 18 verse 13. Thereupon Hezekiah thought it prudent to avert his wrath by a promise of submission, and consented to pay 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold, to raise which enormous sum he was obliged to spoil the temple of many of its treasures, and even to strip the gold from the gates. 2 Kings 18 verses 14 to 16. The respite thus obtained was only temporary. 2 years had barely elapsed before Sennacherib, resolved to conquer the now flourishing kingdom of Egypt, commenced a second expedition through the dominions of Judah. While one of his generals attacked and captured Ashdod, he himself marched through Palestine and laid siege to Libnah and Lachish, cities in the maritime lowland of Judah, and at this time subject to Egypt. From Lachish, however, he sent the Tartanor, his commander-in-chief, the Rabsaris, or his chief eunuch, and the Rabshakeh, his chief cupbearer, with a large force to Jerusalem to demand its surrender. On this occasion, the chief cupbearer seems to have been at the head of the embassy. Standing by the conduit of the upper pool and speaking in the Hebrew tongue, he proclaimed to the advisers of Hezekiah and the people assembled on the city walls the message of the king of Assyria, exhorting them not to look for deliverance from Egypt or even to place any confidence in their God. For what God had yet been able to deliver his land and people out of the hand of his master? 2 Kings 18 verses 33-34. By command of Hezekiah, his scornful message was received in profound silence. The king himself, on being informed of the purport of the Assyrian embassy, with clothes rent and robed in sackcloth, repaired to the temple, and sent his minister, similarly attired, to Isaiah, to entreat him in his perilous hour to lift up his prayer in behalf of his people. That undaunted prophet in reply bade his master defy boldly all the efforts of the enemy. That God, whom the Assyrian had blasphemed, would avenge his insulted honour. He would send a blast upon him, and he should hear a rumour, and should return to his own land, there to fall by the sword. These trustful words encouraged both king and people, and the Assyrian ambassadors, finding it impossible to terrify the capital of Judah into subjection, returned to Sennacherib, whom they found at Libnah, having taken or raised the siege of Lachish. 2 Kings 19 and verse 8. But while he was thus employed, news reached the ears of that monarch that Tirhakah or Tarakos, a powerful king of Ethiopia, was on the march against him. On this he resolved to make one more effort to terrify Hezekiah into submission, and send a second embassy to him, with a letter demanding in the most peremptory terms the surrender of the city, recapitulating the cities whose gods had been powerless to deliver them out of his hands, and bidding him dismiss the notion that he could escape. On receiving this vaunting letter, Hezekiah again repaired to the temple, and there spread it before the Lord, entreating in words of singular pathos and beauty the aid of the God of Israel, who dwelt between the cherubims. 2 Kings 19 verse 15. His prayer was heard. Isaiah was commissioned to assure the king that the virgin, the daughter of Zion, might laugh to scorn all the efforts of the invader. True it was that the Assyrian monarch had laid waste many cities into ruinous heaps, but it was only because Jehovah himself had so willed it, and had raised him up to be an instrument for the accomplishment of his own purposes. And now he would put his hook in the Assyrian's nose, and his bridle in his lips, and turn him back by the way he had come, nor suffer him even to approach the city, or to shoot an arrow there, or cast up a bank against it. 2 Kings 19 verse 32. His words were destined to have a speedy and terrible fulfillment. Having reduced Libnah, Sennacherib appears to have pushed forward towards Pelusium, anxious to crush an Egyptian army under a native prince named Sethos, before the dreaded Ethiopian monarch Tirhakah or Tirhakah could come to his aid. Within sight of each other, the Assyrian and Egyptian hosts lay down, awaiting the morrow's battle. But that very night, the angel of the Lord, probably by a sudden pestilence or some more awful manifestation of divine power, poured contempt on all the pride of the Assyrian monarch. As they slept, a sudden destruction fell upon his hosts, and when he awoke next morning, behold, 185,000 corpses lay dead in his camp. On this Sennacherib fled with the shattered remnants of his forces to his own land, where, 17 years after, or BC 680, he was assassinated by his sons Adramelech and Sharezer, as he was worshipping in the temple of Nisroch, his god, leaving his throne to another son, Esarhaddon. 2 Kings 19, verse 37. At some period after, or as some think before his signal deliverance, Hezekiah was seized with a serious illness, and was warned by the prophet Isaiah to put his house in order, for the decree had gone forth that he must die. This announcement caused the greatest distress to the good king. He had striven to set a good example while he lived, and had done much to reform his people and their religion, and now in the very midst of his work he must die. With many tears, therefore, he turned his face to the wall and pleaded his case with God, praying that the prophet's words might not be so immediately fulfilled. His prayer was heard. Isaiah was bidden to assure him that his life would be prolonged for a space of 15 years, and as a sign to confirm this assurance, the shadow on the great dial of his father Ahaz went 10 degrees backwards, and by the application of a plaster of figs, often used medicinally in such cases, his malady was healed. News of his recovery, and of the astronomical marvel accompanying it, was conveyed into many lands, and various ambassadors with letters and gifts came to his court. Amongst the rest came those of Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylon, who with their retinue were escorted over the royal treasures. For the pride and ostentation with which he displayed his rich stores, Hezekiah was rebuked by Isaiah, who foretold that a day was coming when all these treasures would be carried away into the country of the very king whose ambassadors had now come to congratulate him, and that his sons would be compelled to serve as eunuchs in the Babylonian court. 2 Kings 20 verses 17 to 19. The remainder of Hezekiah's reign appears to have been spent in peace and security. His treasury was full, the agricultural resources of the country were developed, various new and useful improvements were carried out in his capital, and on his death, lamented by all Judah and Jerusalem, he was buried with especial honour in the chiefest of the sepulchres of the sons of David. BC 698. 2 Chronicles 32 verses 27 to 33. End of Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 5 of A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear, recorded by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 6 of A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear. Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 6, Reign of Manasseh, Reforms of Josiah. 2 Kings, chapters 21 to 23, 2 Chronicles, chapters 33 to 35, BC 698 to 623. On the death of Hezekiah, his son Manasseh succeeded to the throne at a very early age, having been born in all probability 12 years before his father's death, BC 710. His mother, whose name was Hephzibah, the delightsome one, Isaiah 62 verse 4, was descended from one of the princes of Jerusalem. His own name is remarkable and was borne by no one else in the history of the kingdom of Judah. It is the name of the tribe second only to Ephraim in hostility to Judah, and has been supposed to have been given to him in remembrance of the fond hope of his father to unite the remnants of Manasseh and other northern tribes in a common worship and faith. The accession of this king at the early age of 12 years was the signal for an entire revolution in the religious policy which his father had so consistently carried out. It has been suggested that the idolatrous party, which had sided with Ahaz and had only been repressed during the reign of Hezekiah, now recovered its old ascendancy and exercised a baneful influence over the youthful monarch. Whether this was so or not, the spirit of loyalty to Jehovah which Hezekiah had evinced was exchanged for a more general adoption of heathen modes of worship than had disfigured even the idolatrous days of Ahaz. Not only were the high places restored, but the worst enormities of Ahab were introduced into Jerusalem. Altars were erected in honour of Baal and Ashtaroth and all the host of heaven, even within the sacred precincts of the temple. 2 Chronicles 33 verses 4 and 5. The king himself not only observed times and used enchantments and witchcraft and dealt with a familiar spirit and with wizards, 2 Chronicles 33 verse 6, but even dedicated some of his sons in the fire to Moloch and slaughtered others. Ezekiel 23 verses 37 to 39. The cries of human victims offered in honour of this hideous deity of the Ammonites re-echoed throughout the valley of Hinnom, and the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah were practised with impunity in that city where Jehovah had said that he would put his name forever. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 4. The consequent moral degeneracy was fearful. The old faith was everywhere neglected and despised. The altar of Jehovah was broken down, 2 Chronicles 33 verse 16. Even the ark was displaced, 2 Chronicles 35 verse 3. And so systematic was the destruction of the sacred books that 50 years later the discovery of the book of the law was an event exciting wonder and astonishment, 2 Kings 22 verse 8, while the Sabbath, the sign between the elect nation and Jehovah, was polluted, Isaiah 56 verse 2, 58 verse 13, and under the influence of the king and his idolatrous advisers, the people did more evil than did the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the children of Israel. 2 Kings 21 verse 9. Meanwhile, the voice of the prophets was not hushed. Heedless of the doom they incurred, the Lord's true servants bore their faithful testimony against the deeds of the king. They predicted the coming of such judgments on Judah and Jerusalem that whoever heard of them, both his ears would tingle. 2 Kings 21 verse 12. The line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab should be stretched over the capital of Judah, and it should be wiped as a man wipeth a dish, and its people should be delivered into the hands of their enemies. 2 Kings 21 verses 13 and 14. These outspoken rebukes met with their natural reward. It was now, according to the ancient Jewish tradition, that the aged Isaiah was sawn asunder, while of other less known but no less faithful servants of Jehovah, such numbers were murdered that the streets of Jerusalem ran with blood. 2 Kings 21 verse 16. Such a policy brought its inevitable punishment. Risings of the Philistines, Moabites, and Ammonites, Zephaniah 2 verses 4 to 15, Jeremiah 47 to 49, were speedily followed by an invasion of the territory of Judah by the Assyrians, 2 Chronicles 33 verse 11. The captains of Esarhaddon, who had crushed the rebellion of Merodach-Baladan, invested Jerusalem, took Manasseh captive, and carried him off to Babylon, where, loaded with fetters, he was cast into prison. But in the solitude of his dungeon, the Jewish king repented of the awful wickedness he had committed, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers, who, in his infinite mercy, listened to his petitions for forgiveness. His defection was pardoned by Esarhaddon, and he was permitted to return to Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 13. The lessons learnt in captivity were not forgotten by the restored monarch. He set himself to effect so much of a religious reformation as his previous character would allow. The worship of Jehovah was renewed, sacrifices were once more offered in his honour, and the heathen altars within the sacred precincts of the temple were destroyed. But the change was naturally but partial. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 17. During his long reign of 55 years, the evil he had done had sunk too deeply to be easily removed. The recollection of the innocent blood he had shed was never forgotten, and at his death he was not laid in the sepulchres of the kings, but in the garden of his own house, in the garden of Uzzah, BC 643. 2 Kings 21 verse 26. Amon his son now succeeded to the throne, and after a short reign of 2 years fell a victim to a conspiracy and was slain in his own palace. The people, however, put the conspirators to death and secured the throne for his son Josiah, now only 8 years of age, BC 641. Young as he was, the new king displayed a remarkable spirit of loyalty to Jehovah and surpassed even the best of his predecessors in his zeal for the true faith. In the 12th year of his reign, 2 Chronicles 34 verse 3, BC 629, he commenced a great reform. In Jerusalem itself he removed the altars dedicated to Baal and all the host of heaven, and burnt the symbol of Ashtaroth at the brook Kidron and the sacred horses that had been dedicated to the sun. He then commenced a personal tour, not only throughout his own dominions, but throughout Simeon, Ephraim, Manasseh, and even distant Naphtali. 2 Chronicles 34 verse 6. At Bethel he visited Jeroboam's chapel, and agreeably to the remarkable prophecy of the disobedient prophet, uttered 300 years before, broke down the altar and high places that king had set up, exhumed the bones from the sepulchres in the neighbouring mount, and scattered them over the altars. A little further, one of the sepulchres attracted his attention, and in answer to his inquiries, he learnt that it contained the remains of the old prophet of Bethel and his victim, the man of God from Judah. On this, he directed that the sepulchre should be spared, and the venerable relics carefully preserved. 2 Kings 23 verses 15 to 19. Returning to Jerusalem, in the 18th year of his reign he empowered a special commission to restore the temple and to levy contributions for this purpose. In the course of his repairs, Hilkiah, the high priest, found a roll containing the book of the law, probably the book of Deuteronomy, which he delivered to Shaphan the scribe, or royal secretary. By him portions were read in the ears of the king, who, struck with alarm at its awful denunciations, rent his clothes and directed that the divine will should be instantly consulted, that the wrath of heaven might not descend on the apostate nation. The high priest and the rest thereupon sought the advice of the prophetess named Huldah, the wife of Shallum, keeper of the royal wardrobe, who resided in one of the sacred cloisters of the temple. In reply, she assured them that the divine judgments would certainly be fulfilled, not indeed in the reign of Josiah, whose early piety had found favour with Jehovah, but after he had been gathered to his fathers. This answer was in due course returned to the king, who instantly repaired to the temple and caused the awful denunciations on idolatry to be publicly read in the ears of the assembled people. The effect was very great. The people, conscience-stricken and appalled, made a solemn covenant and promised to adhere thenceforward to the worship of the true God, and agreed to a still more thorough reformation. After a restoration of the ancient Levitical service in the temple, a national celebration of the Passover was decreed, and was carried out with a grandeur and magnificence exceeding anything that had been seen on any former occasion. 2 Kings 23, verses 21 to 23. End of Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 6 of A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear. Read by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 7 of A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear. Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 7, Death of Josiah, Captivity of Judah. 2 Kings chapters 23-24, 2 Chronicles chapters 35 and 36, BC 623 to 588. But the religious reformations of the pious king could not ward off the destined destruction of his kingdom. At this period, the great Assyrian Empire had considerably declined, while the kingdom of Egypt, under a powerful monarch named Necho, had recovered much of its ancient glory. This king now resolved to gain possession of Carchemish, which commanded the passage of the Euphrates. From motives which cannot be certainly divined, Josiah resolved to oppose his progress through his own territory, and, in spite of an embassy from the Egyptian monarch begging him not to interfere, drew up his forces at Megiddo, and, as though with a presentiment of his doom, disguised himself before entering into battle. His fears were verified. Struck by the Egyptian archers, he was removed from the battlefield to die before he reached Jerusalem, where he was committed to the grave amidst the profoundest grief of his people, and especially of the prophet Jeremiah, who composed a funeral elegy over this last and best of the kings of Judah, BC 610. 2 Chronicles 35, verse 25, Lamentations 4, verse 20. His son and successor, Jehoahaz, or Shallum, Jeremiah 22, verse 11, only held the throne for 3 months. On his return from Carchemish, Necho condemned the land to pay a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold, and sending for the new king to Riblah in the land of Hamath, put him in bonds and thence removed him to Egypt, where he died. 2 Kings 23, verse 34. His brother Eliakim was now permitted by the Egyptian monarch to ascend the throne, and in obedience to the same authority changed his name to Jehoiakim. In the 4th year of his reign, or BC 606, Nebuchadnezzar, placed by his father Nabopolassar at the head of the Assyrian armies, marched forth to avenge the Egyptian invasion. In a pitched battle at Carchemish, Jeremiah 46 verses 1 to 13, he utterly defeated Pharaoh Necho and recovered Coel Syria, Phoenicia and northern Palestine. Then, advancing into Judea, he drove all who had no fenced cities, and amongst the rest the Rechabites, Jeremiah 35 verse 11, to Jerusalem, captured that city, placed Jehoiakim in fetters, rifled the temple, and carried off to Babylon some of the sacred vessels and many of the principal Hebrew nobles, including Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel 1 verses 1 to 6. On promise, however, of faithfulness to his liege lord, Jehoiakim was suffered to retain his kingly dignity, at least in name, for 3 years longer. At the close of this period, he had the hardihood to try and throw off the yoke, and rebelled against his suzerain. But this only involved his kingdom in deeper misery. Unable to take the field in person, Nebuchadnezzar sent a numerous force against him from his now subject provinces of Chaldea and Syria, as well as Moab and Ammon, 2 Kings 24 verse 2. These overran the whole country and reduced it to the lowest degree of wretchedness and misery. During the period of degradation that now ensued, Jehoiakim, either in a contest with some of his many foes, or owing to a rising of his oppressed subjects, came to a violent end. His body lay ignominiously exposed upon the ground, and was buried with the burial of an ass, without pomp or ceremony, beyond the gates of Jerusalem. BC 599, Jeremiah 22 verses 18 and 19, 36 verse 30. Jehoiakim his son, also called Jeconiah and Coniah, was now placed upon the throne, 2 Chronicles 36 verse 9. But after a reign of 3 months and 10 days, Nebuchadnezzar's army appeared before Jerusalem, and the young king and his court surrendered at discretion. The temple was again pillaged of such vessels that yet remained. The king himself, the nobles, and chief artisans were removed to Babylon, and none, save the poorest of the population, were left behind. 2 Kings 24 verses 8 to 16. Mattaniah, the uncle of the captive king, was now placed by the Babylonian monarch in charge of the exhausted kingdom, and took the name of Zedekiah. In defiance of the dictates of common prudence, and of the advice of the prophet Jeremiah, Jeremiah 27 and 28, compare Ezekiel 17 verses 12 to 21, he was foolish enough to court an alliance with Pharaoh Hophra, or Apries, a new and enterprising monarch in Egypt. Instantly the Babylonian armies were put into motion, and overran all Judah, while Jerusalem together with Lachish and Azekah alone held out. A temporary delay was caused by an effort of the king of Egypt to relieve his ally, and the necessity of first repulsing the Egyptian forces. This achieved, the Chaldeans again presented themselves before the walls of the holy city, and besieged it for upwards of 16 months. The wretched inhabitants were reduced to the most fearful straits. Famine prevailed throughout the city, 2 Kings 25 verse 3. The tongue of the sucking child clave to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The young children cried for bread, and no man brake it unto them. Lamentations 4 verse 4. Nobles that had ever before fed delicately searched even dunghills for any remnants of food that might be found. Lamentations 4 and verse 5. And mothers boiled their own children. Lamentations 4 verse 10. The Lord at last poured upon the city the cup of his fierce anger for all its iniquities, and its day of doom was come. At length the Chaldean armies effected a breach in the strong walls, and made their way into the city. With a few of his troops, Zedekiah effected his escape to Jericho, but was pursued, captured, and sent to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. Judgment was then passed upon him, 2 Kings 25 verse 6. And his sons having first been put to death before his face, his eyes were thrust out, and laden with fetters, he was removed to Babylon, BC 588. Punishment having thus been inflicted on the king, Nebuzaradan, an officer high in the confidence of the Babylonian monarch, was dispatched to Jerusalem to carry out the complete destruction of the city. By his orders, the temple, the royal palace, the houses of the wealthy were set on fire. The walls were broken down, the sacred vessels of the once glorious house of Jehovah were plundered, the brazen pillars were broken up, the chief priests were put to death, and the rest, with the greater part of the inhabitants, were removed to Babylon. A scanty remnant was permitted to remain in their native land to be vine-dressers and husbandmen, Jeremiah 52 verse 16, under the superintendence of Gedaliah, who with a Chaldean guard, Jeremiah 40 verse 1, 2 and 5, was stationed at Mizpah, 2 Kings 25 verse 23, Jeremiah 40 verse 6, a strong fortress 6 miles north of Jerusalem. Declining the offer of a retreat at Babylon, Jeremiah resolved to share the lot of this miserable remnant in his own land, Jeremiah 40 verse 6. But even the late terrible misfortunes could not calm the spirit of faction. Gedaliah was assassinated under circumstances of revolting treachery by Ishmael, a man of royal blood, together with some of the Chaldean guard. See 2 Kings 25 verse 25, Jeremiah 41 verses 1 to 10. Johanan, one of the captains of the army of Judah, who had in vain warned Gedaliah of his danger, Jeremiah 40 verses 13 to 16, gathered a force and pursued the assassin as far as Gibeon, but he effected his escape beyond Jordan to the country of the Ammonites, Jeremiah 41 verse 15. Then the little remnant of Jews, fearful of the vengeance of the Babylonian monarch, contrary to the advice of Jeremiah, Jeremiah 42 verses 7 to 22, fled into Egypt, and after first settling at Tahpanhes, Jeremiah 43 verse 7, were scattered throughout the country at Migdol, Noph, and Pathros, Jeremiah 44 verse 1, whither also Jeremiah accompanied them to share their fortunes and to die. End of Book 10, Part 3, Chapter 7. Read by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia.
Section 73 of a Class Book of Old Testament History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Class Book of Old Testament History by George Frederick Maclear. Duration, relation, contrast of the two kingdoms. A footnote for Part 3, Chapter 7. Before passing on, a few remarks may here be subjoined respecting the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, which now came to an end. 1. Their respective duration. The kingdom of Israel lasted from B.C. 975 to B.C. 721, or 254 years. The kingdom of Judah lasted from B.C. 975 to B.C. 588, or 387 years, thus outliving her more populous and powerful rival by 133 years. 2. Their mutual relations. These, as we have seen, were dictated by 3 different lines of policy. The first, mutual animosity from B.C. 975 to 918. The first 3 kings of Judah, Rehoboam, Abijah, and Asa, persisted in the hope of regaining their authority over the 10 tribes, and for nearly 60 years there was war between the 2 kingdoms. Second, close alliance and united hostility to Syria from B.C. 918 to 1845. With the accession of Jehoshaphat, there sprang up an alliance between the 2 kingdoms, cemented by intermarriage, and prompted probably by the necessity of joint action in resisting the encroaching power of Syria. Third, fresh animosity and the gradual decline of both kingdoms before the advancing power of the Assyrian Empire from B.C. 884 to 588. The alliance between the kingdoms was rudely shattered by the accession of Jehu to the throne of Israel. He put Athaliah to death, and the hostility thus begun reached its highest pitch under Amaziah, Joash, and Pekah. 3. Their contrasts. First, in the kingdom of Judah, A. There was always a fixed capital and a venerated center of religion. B. The army was always subordinate. C. The succession was interrupted by no revolution. and D. The priests remained faithful to the crown. Second, in the kingdom of Israel, A. There was no fixed capital and no real religious center. B. The army was often insubordinate. C. The succession was constantly interrupted, so that out of 19 kings, there were no less than 9 dynasties, each ushered in by a revolution. D. The authorized priests left the kingdom in a body, and the priesthood established by Jeroboam had no divine sanction and no promise. It was corrupt in its very source. Hence, in the kingdom of Israel, the prophets were the regular ministers of God, and especially during the second of the 2 periods above mentioned, their ministry was distinguished by far more extraordinary events than in the kingdom of Judah, whose annals offered no prophetical deeds like those of Elijah and Elisha. End of section 73.
Book 11, Chapter 1 of a Class Book of Old Testament History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Owlivia. A Class Book of Old Testament History by George Frederick Maclear. Book 11, From the Captivity to the Close of the Canon. Chapter 1, Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapters 1 through 3, circa 606 through 570 BC. Nothing, it has been remarked, could present a more striking contrast to their native country than the region into which the Hebrews were now transplanted. Instead of their irregular and picturesque mountain city, crowning its unequal heights, and looking down into the deep and precipitous ravines, through one of which a scanty stream wound along, they entered the vast, square, and level city of Babylon, occupying both sides of the broad Euphrates, while all around spread immense plains, which were intersected by long, straight canals bordered by rows of willows. How unlike their national temple, a small but highly finished and richly adorned fabric, standing in the midst of its courts, on the brow of a lofty precipice. The colossal temple of the Chaldean Bel, rising from the plain, with its 8 stupendous stories or towers, one above the other, to the perpendicular height of a furlong. The palace of the Babylonian king was more than twice the size of their whole city. It covered 8 miles, with its hanging gardens built on arched terraces, each rising above the other, and rich in all the luxuriance of artificial cultivation. How different from the sunny cliffs of their own land, where the olive and the vine grew spontaneously, and the cool, shady, and secluded valleys, where they could always find shelter from the heat of the burning noon. No wonder, then, that, in the pathetic words of their own hymn, by the waters of Babylon they sat down and wept, when they remembered thee, O Zion. Psalm 87, verse 1. Thus far removed from their native land, amidst a strange people and strange rites, and exposed to all the influences of contact with their conquerors, we might, in the usual order of things, have expected that the Jews would have ceased to remain a nation at all. But with them it was not to be thus. The 10 tribes, indeed, are never heard of more, but the remnant of Judah and Benjamin in Babylonia, so far from blending its national life with that of its conquerors, remained a separate people, and preserved its national institutions. We shall very much misunderstand their condition if we suppose that the Jews became bondsmen or serfs. They were colonists rather than captives. They received grants of land, agricultural or pastoral, out of the conquered territories at the disposal of Nebuchadnezzar, and so valuable were their services considered that not a few rose to high eminence, Daniel chapter 2, verse 48, and held confidential positions next to the person of the sovereign. While, moreover, they increased in numbers and wealth, they retained an internal jurisdiction over their own members. They kept up among themselves distinction of rank. They preserved their genealogies. Nehemiah 7, verses 5, 6, and 64. And, although from the absence of any common center of worship, they could only observe the Mosaic law in part, still they retained the rite of circumcision, the distinction of meats, and other points. Compare Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, with Esther chapter 3, verse 8. Nor did the providence, which had hitherto watched over them, fail them in the land of exile. The voice of prophecy, so far from being hushed, now swelled into louder strains. While Jeremiah warned and exhorted them at the outset of this sad period in their history, Ezekiel did not fail for 30 years to carry on the same work in the land of exile itself, while another, and one of the most illustrious of their number, rose to the very highest position and proved the Moses of captivity and the 4th of the greater prophets. In the 4th year of Jehoiakim, BC 606, as we have already seen, Nebuchadnezzar had ordered the chief of the eunuchs to remove to Babylon, certain select youths of royal descent, who, from their talents, seemed likely to be of service to his court. One of these was Daniel, apparently of royal blood, Daniel chapter 1, verse 3, and gifted with no common talents, Daniel 1, verse 4. With 3 other companions of the tribe of Judah, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he was removed to the Babylonian court, and there trained for the king's service in the learning of the language of the Chaldeans, Daniel 1, verse 4. Moreover, in accordance with a common custom, his name was changed, and he and his 3 companions were now known as Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. During the 3 years of their training, they were not forgetful of the law and religion of their fathers, and with unusual firmness of character declined to partake of the daily allowance of meat and wine supplied them from the royal table, either probably because it was ceremonially unclean or had been offered in sacrifice to the Assyrian gods. Preferring to live on the simplest fare, they yet proved as comely and well-favored as though they had been fed on the rarest dainties, and when brought before Nebuchadnezzar, were pronounced to excel, in wisdom and knowledge, the wisest men in his empire, and were rewarded with high positions about his court. Daniel 1, verse 5. While they were thus employed, a remarkable circumstance took place. Nebuchadnezzar dreamt a dream which exceedingly troubled his spirit. Summoning the Magi and astrologers, he demanded that it should be instantly interpreted. They promised the interpretation, if they might be told the dream. But though this had escaped the monarch's memory, he reiterated his command, and when told that to obey it was impossible, issued an edict commanding the instant destruction of all the wise men throughout his realms. This despotic order was made known to Daniel by Arioch, the captain of the executioners, who was charged to see it carried out. The Jewish exile instantly sought an audience with the monarch, and having succeeded in gaining time for a fuller consideration, summoned his 3 friends, who, with fervent prayer to him, from whom no secrets are hid, besought a revelation of the dream. Their prayers were heard, and at a second audience, Daniel disclosed the vision of the night. The monarch had beheld a great image, the form of which was terrible. The head was of fine gold, the breast and the arms of silver, the belly and sides of brass, the legs of iron, the feet partly iron and partly clay. The excellent brightness of this image the monarch had watched till he suddenly saw a stone, cut out of a mountain without hands, smite the feet of the image till it broke in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, while the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Such was the vision which Daniel then proceeded to interpret. The king himself was this head of gold. To him the God of heaven had given a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. After him should arise another kingdom inferior to his. After that, a 3rd kingdom of brass, which should bear rule over all the earth, to which would succeed a 4th kingdom, strong as iron, breaking in pieces and subduing all things. That kingdom, with its feet and toes, part of iron and part of clay, would be partly strong and partly brittle, and its subjects would mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they would not cleave one to the other, even as iron is not mixed with clay, and would make room for another kingdom, which God himself would set up, to break in pieces and consume all the previous kingdoms, and itself stand forever. Daniel chapter 2, verses 36 through 45. The great Babylonian monarch was profoundly affected by this proof of superhuman knowledge. He fell down on his face and worshipped Daniel, commanded that an oblation and sweet odors should be offered unto him, bestowed on him costly presents, and made him viceroy over the whole province of Babylon, and supreme over all the wise men of his empire. In the hour of his prosperity, Daniel did not forget his 3 companions. By his intercession, similar honors were bestowed upon them, while he himself retained the preeminence in the gate of the king. Daniel 2, verses 46 through 49. Though on this memorable occasion the new viceroy had been preeminently faithful to the God of his fathers, and by his ascription of all his wisdom to a higher power, had made the great monarch he served acknowledge that there was a God of gods and Lord of lords, the lesson does not seem to have made a very lasting impression on Nebuchadnezzar's mind. In the vast empire he had won by his arms, there were many different nations, with different gods, and different modes of worship. Over all he was supreme, and with the true feeling of an oriental despot, it seemed to him only right that they should all acknowledge his chief deity. This was the great Bel, or Bel-Merodach, the supreme chief of gods, the king of the heavens and the earth, the Jupiter of the Babylonian pantheon. It was possibly an image of this god, 60 cubits high and 6 broad, and overlaid with golden plates, which he now proceeded to set up on the plain of Dura, with the command that at the sound of instruments of music, all his subjects, from the highest to the lowest, should fall down and worship it, on penalty of being flung into a burning fiery furnace. Daniel 3, verses 5 and 6. In accordance with this edict, all the officers of the court of Babylon and the governors of the different provinces who had been summoned to assist at the ceremony flocked to the plain of Dura, and with one consent, as soon as the music sounded, prostrated themselves before the great dumb image which their Lord had set up. But Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in this hour of trial, remained faithful to the religion of their fathers, neither falling down nor worshipping with the rest. This act of disobedience to their master was quickly perceived by many of the native Chaldeans, who were already filled with jealousy at the elevation of the exiles, and they were not slow in reporting it to Nebuchadnezzar. On hearing it, that monarch's wrath knew no bounds. He summoned them before him. He reiterated the command he had already issued. He warned them, in spite of their high position, they should certainly suffer the penalty of their disobedience. But his words were wasted. These 3 mighty ones in the noble army of martyrs replied that if they were not careful to answer him in this matter, their God could, if such was his will, deliver them from the fiery furnace, and even if he did not, they would not serve the monarch's God, or bow down before the image he had set up. Daniel 3, verses 16 through 18. This outspoken refusal filled Nebuchadnezzar with still greater fury. The form of his visage was changed. He bade the furnace be heated 7 times more than it was wont to be heated, and ordered the mightiest captains in his army to bind the 3 and fling them into the fire. His words were obeyed, but at the cost of the lives of his captains, who fell victims to their zeal, being caught by the raging flames. Moreover, when he looked to see the 3 martyrs speedily reduced to ashes, behold, they were observed loose, walking unscathed in the midst of the fire, accompanied by a celestial being, in whom the monarch discerned none other than a son of God. Thereupon he drew near to the mouth of the furnace, and bade his intended victims come forth. And they came forth, and on their bodies, as all attested, the fire was seen to have had no power, neither was a hair of their head singed, neither had the smell of fire passed over them. Filled with admiration for their heroic faith, the monarch issued a decree that all men, far and wide, throughout his empire, should revere the God of these Hebrews, and that every people, nation, or language that spake a word against their God should be cut in pieces and their houses made a dunghill. Daniel 3, verse 29. End of Book 11, Chapter 1. Recording by Owlivia.
Book 11, Chapter 2 of A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. A Class Book of Old Testament History by G.F. Maclear. Book 11, Chapter 2. Reigns of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. Daniel's chapter 4 through 6, BC 570 to 538. Though from the incident just recorded, Nebuchadnezzar had learnt to know the greatness of the God of Israel, a still sterner lesson was needed to teach him his own position in reference to the Most High. He was by far the greatest of the Babylonian monarchs. His name was known, his power was dreaded throughout the entire eastern world. He was the conqueror of Syria, of Phoenicia, of Tyre, of Palestine. He was the adorner and beautifier of his native land. He built noble cities, he raised stately temples, he renovated, fortified, almost rebuilt Babylon. He constructed quays and breakwaters, reservoirs, canals, and aqueducts on a scale of grandeur and magnificence surpassing everything of the kind recorded in history. Perhaps no single man ever left behind him as his memorial 1/2 the amount of building which was erected by this king. The palace he built for himself in Babylon, with its triple walls, its hanging gardens, its plated pillars, was regarded in his day as one of the wonders of the world, while even at the present hour it is his name which is stamped upon well-nigh every brick found amidst the ruins of his capital. Amidst all this earthly grandeur, he had grown and become strong. His greatness reached unto heaven, and his dominion to the end of the earth. Inflated with pride, he became a god unto himself, and knew not that he was but an instrument in the hand of him who ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. Daniel 4, verse 17. This was the lesson he had now to learn, and he learned it on this wise. One night he dreamed a dream, which none of his wise men could interpret. Daniel, therefore, was once more summoned before him, and listened while the monarch revealed the vision of the night. I saw, he said, and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great, reaching unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit much, and the beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh fed of it. And behold, there came down from heaven a watcher, and a holy one, who cried out, Hew down the tree, and cut off its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts, and let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given him, and let 7 times pass over him. Such was the vision. What was the interpretation? Daniel did not disguise it from the monarch. The tree was no other than himself. For him there was a great trial in store. A day was near when he would be cast down from his place of power, would be driven from the society of men, and would have his dwelling with the beasts of the field, until 7 times had passed over him, and he revived and knew for a truth that not he, but the Most High ruled in the kingdom of heaven, and gave dominion and power to whomsoever he would. Daniel 4 verses 1 through 27. Thus a warning was given him, but it was disregarded. Nebuchadnezzar did not, as Daniel bade, break off his sins by righteousness, and his iniquities by shewing mercy to the poor. 12 months afterwards he was walking in that glorious palace which he had made for himself, and in a moment of overweening pride he cried, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom of the might of my power, and for the honour of my majesty? The words had hardly been spoken when his doom came upon him. The thick pall of madness settled down upon him. The mind of a man departed from him, and that of a beast entered in. Casting off his robes, he refused the food and habitation of men. Mingling with the cattle in the fields, he remained exposed to the weather day and night, till his hair was grown as eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. Daniel 4, verse 33. Meanwhile, as seems most probable, his queen Nitocris administered his kingdom, and at length, after an interval of 4 or perhaps 7 years, as he did not scruple to declare in a proclamation addressed to his people, he came to himself. His understanding came back to him. He lifted up his eyes to heaven, and blessed the Most High, and praised and honoured him that liveth forever. With his reason, the glory also of his kingdom returned. His counsellors and his lords sought him, and brought him back to his palace, and excellent majesty was added unto him. Resuming his great works, which had been suspended, he added fresh wonders in his old age to the marvellous constructions of his manhood, and after a reign of 43 years, died, BC 561, at the advanced age of 83 or 84, and was succeeded by his son Evil-Merodach. Shortly after his accession, the new king released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from the prison where he had been confined for 38 years, set his throne above the throne of the other captive princes at Babylon, and gave him a daily allowance from the royal table. 2 Kings 25, verses 27 to 30. But in the course of 1 or 2 years he was assassinated, and one of the conspirators, Neriglissar or Nerigasolasar, usurped the throne, BC 559, and held the government for 3 years and a half, bequeathing it to his son, Laboroso-Arkod, BC 556. In the course of 9 months, he was succeeded by Nabonidus or Labynetus, BC 555. Meanwhile, the neighbouring kingdom of Media had been the scene of a great revolution, in which Babylon eventually became involved. Mandane, a daughter of Astyages, who mounted the Median throne BC 595, married Cambyses, a Persian of the royal family of the Achaemenidae, and became the mother of Cyrus the Great. Alienated by his tyranny and wearying of his rule of a large body of the subjects of Astyages, transferred their affections to this prince, who, heading a revolt, defeated and captured the Median king near Pasargadae, BC 559, and obtained the supremacy over the combined Medo-Persic Empire. At first, the conqueror did not march against Babylon, and Nabonidus formed an alliance with Croesus, king of Lydia, and employed himself diligently in strengthening his capital, storing up provisions, and erecting defensive works. But Cyrus gained a complete victory over the Lydian king, BC 546, and at the end of about 6 years appeared before Babylon. After a single engagement, he drove the Babylonians within their defences, Jeremiah 51, verse 30, and commenced a regular siege. At this time, Nabonidus does not appear to have been present in his capital, having fled to Borsippa after the late engagement, but he left behind him a son, whom he had, a few years before, admitted to a share in the government. This was Belshazzar, the Belshazzar of the scripture narrative. This prince made a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, his wives and concubines, and high estates of the realm, in the midst of which, heated with wine, he commanded that all the gold and silver vessels, which his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the plunder of Jerusalem, should be brought forth, and from them the assembled guests drank in honour of their various gods. But in the midst of their festivities, the finger of a man's hand was seen to write mysterious words on the plaister of the palace wall. Instantly, all the brightness of Belshazzar's countenance vanished. His thoughts troubled him. His knees smote one against the other. With loud voice he bade the astrologers and soothsayers be brought before him, and promised honour, place, and power to any that would interpret the mystic words. But this none of the wise men of his realm could do. Amidst the alarm and confusion, the Queen Mother now entered and advised that they should consult Daniel, who seems at this time to have been living in close retirement. Accordingly he was brought in, and after declining all the monarch's promised rewards, sternly rebuked him, for that though he knew all that his grandfather's pride had brought down upon him, he had yet lifted up himself against the Lord of heaven, and in impious triumph profaned the sacred vessels once dedicated to that God who now had sent him this message. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Daniel 5, verses 25 to 28. That very night the prophet's words were fulfilled. Having diverted the course of the Euphrates, Cyrus assaulted the city from the dry bed of the river, captured it, and slew Belshazzar, BC 538, thus fulfilling the prophecies of Isaiah, Isaiah 21, verse 9, and Jeremiah, Jeremiah 51, verses 31 to 39. Hastening on to other conquests, Cyrus entrusted the captured city to a viceroy, known in Scripture as Darius the Mede. He signalized his accession to power by setting over the kingdom of Babylon proper, either a body of councillors or provincial governors, 120 princes, subject to the authority of 3 presidents, of whom Daniel, now far advanced in life, was chief. Daniel 6 and verse 2. Old and grey-headed, he still remained faithful to the God of his fathers, and now moved with jealousy at his elevation, the other nobles resolved to compass his ruin. Unable to accuse him of any failure in the administration of the kingdom, they persuaded Darius to pass an irrevocable decree, like the law of the Medes and the Persians, ordaining that for a space of 30 days no one should offer up any petition to any god or man save to the monarch himself, on penalty of being flung into the den of lions. This decree Daniel regarded not. Steadfast in the religion of his fathers, he opened the windows of his chamber towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day, as had been his wont, offered up his prayers to his God. The nobles now had the opportunity they had coveted, and they reported his conduct to the king. Sorely against his will, and after fruitless efforts to deliver him from their malice, Darius bade the sentence be executed. The aged prophet was flung into the den. The mouth thereof was closed and sealed with the royal signet, and the signet of the lords and princes. Fasting and sleepless, the monarch passed the night. Neither were instruments of music brought before him. Rising early in the morning, he sought out the lion's den, and to his great joy found that Jehovah had protected his faithful servant, had sent his angel, and shut the lions' mouths. Thereupon he ordered him to be brought forth, and then issued instructions for the immediate execution of his accusers, who, according to the cruel but usual Oriental custom, were, with their wives and children, flung into the den and torn to pieces. Not content with this, he proclaimed that throughout his vast empire, adoration should be paid to the God of Daniel, the living God, steadfast forever, who worketh signs and wonders in heaven, and hath delivered his servant from the power of the lions. Daniel 6, verse 27. End of Book 11, Chapter 2 of a class book of Old Testament history by G. F. Maclear. Recorded by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. Book 11, Chapter 3 of a class book of Old Testament history by G. F. Maclear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia. A class book of Old Testament history by G. F. Maclear. Book 11, Chapter 3, Rebuilding of the Temple, Esther and Ahasuerus. Ezra chapters 1 through 4, Esther chapters 1 through 10, BC 536 to 479. At the time when Cyrus thus became the ruler of an empire greater even than Assyria itself, 70 years had elapsed since the capture of Jerusalem in the reign of Jehoiakim. Daniel 9 verses 1 and 2. The prosperity he already enjoyed under so many sovereigns, Daniel still retained under the new monarch, and it was probably through his influence that in the first year of his reign, or BC 536, Cyrus issued a decree giving permission to the Jews to return to their native land and rebuild their temple. To aid them in doing so, he restored to them the sacred vessels which Nebuchadnezzar had carried off from Jerusalem, and instructed the pashas throughout the various provinces to afford them every facility for their return. Ezra 1 verses 1 through 6. The majority, however, of the Jews who had for years been comfortably settled in the land of exile, and had there risen to affluence and high positions, preferred to retain their settlements, and only 42,360, attended by 7,337 servants, were found willing to return to their native land. Over this body, Zerubbabel, the head of the house of Judah and grandson of King Jehoiakim, was invested with the supreme authority. He had held some office in the Babylonian court and had received the Chaldean name of Sheshbazzar, appointed by Cyrus to the governorship of Jerusalem and accompanied by the high priest Jeshua and possibly the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, with copious presents of silver and gold, Ezra 1 verses 7 through 11, he set out at the head of the returning colonists and before long reached Jerusalem. 7 months after their return, the altar of burnt sacrifice was re-erected on its ancient site, and the priests and Levites offered burnt offerings and sacrifices. This done, preparations were made by the prince of the captivity for his great work, the rebuilding of the temple. A grant of money for this purpose having been already received from Cyrus, cedar trees were brought from Lebanon to Joppa, masons and carpenters were hired, and in the 2nd month of the 2nd year of their return, the foundations of the 2nd temple were laid, with all the pomp and ceremonial that circumstances admitted. The priests in their apparel with trumpets, the Levites, the sons of Asaph with cymbals, Ezra 3 verses 10 and 11, sang the same psalms, to the sound of which the first temple had been dedicated, and the people responded with a great shout, which, however, was well nigh drowned by the sobs and lamentations of many, especially the older men, who had beheld the glories of the former temple. But the good work was not to proceed unopposed. Informed of their design, the Samaritans requested to be allowed some share in its promotion. This Zerubbabel and Jeshua unwisely rejected, and the Samaritans thereupon exhausted every artifice to prevent the completion of the work. After putting them to various other annoyances, they hired counsellors to misrepresent them at the court of Persia, and eventually succeeded in preventing any further progress during the reign of Cyrus and of his successors Cambyses and Smerdis, BC 525-521, Ezra 4 verses 11 to 24. But in the second year of Darius Hystaspes, BC 520, the stirring words of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, Haggai 1 verses 1 through 8, Zechariah 1 verses 1 through 6, roused once more the spirits of Zerubbabel and Jeshua, and a fresh and determined effort was made to complete the work. The Persian satraps of the province, Tatnai and Shether-Boznai, came to Jerusalem, and after an inspection of the work applied to the Persian court for instructions whether it was to be permitted to go on. Ezra 5 verses 6 through 17. Darius caused the archives at Ecbatana to be searched, and at length the original decree of Cyrus being discovered, he reissued it, and at the same time commanded the Persian satraps, instead of offering any molestation to the Jewish colony, to promote the work to the utmost of their power. Ezra 6 verses 5 to 13. Thus aided, the Jews pressed forward with such vigour that in the 8th year of the reign of Darius, the temple was completed and ready for dedication, BC 516. This ceremony was performed with every solemnity. Numerous sacrifices were offered, the priests were redistributed into courses, and the Passover was celebrated with great rejoicings. Ezra 6 verses 15 to 22. During the remainder of the long reign of Darius, the Jews enjoyed a continuance of peace and tranquillity. But in the year BC 485, Ahasuerus, the Xerxes of profane history, ascended the Persian throne. When he had reigned 3 years, this capricious despot made a feast for all his nobles at Susa, and on the 7th day of the revels ordered Vashti, his queen, to grace the banquet with her presence. With a due concern for her own dignity, the queen declined, which so enraged her lord that he issued a decree deposing her from her royal station, and ordering a general levy of beautiful virgins that he might select from them a new queen. Esther 2 verses 1 to 4. At this time there was living at Susa a Jew named Mordecai, of the tribe of Benjamin. Esther 2 verse 5. Having no child of his own, he had adopted his cousin Hadassah, or Esther, a beautiful orphan. Together with the other virgins, she was brought into the royal harem, and found such favour with the monarch that in the 7th year of his reign, without inquiring into her kindred or people, he ordered her to be crowned in place of the deposed queen. Esther 3 verse 16. By virtue of his relationship, Mordecai too shared in the prosperity of his niece, and became one of those who sat in the king's gate. Esther 2 verse 41. In this capacity he discovered a plot of the eunuchs to assassinate the king, which he duly divulged, and they were executed, while a record of his services was entered in the royal chronicles. But Mordecai had a rival for the royal favour in the person of Haman, an Agagite, that is, probably a descendant of the ancient Amalekite kings. Rapidly outstripping all his other competitors, the new favourite was advanced to the highest position in the kingdom, and was treated with the utmost reverence by everyone save Mordecai only. Stung to the quick at this slight, and having discovered the secret of his rival's lineage, Haman resolved to strike a blow against the nation to which Mordecai belonged. Accordingly, he represented to his royal master that the Jews, scattered and dispersed throughout the provinces of his empire, were a dangerous and turbulent race of alien habits and religion who ought to be put to death, and from the confiscation of their property, he promised to place in the royal coffers upwards of 10,000 talents of silver. The prospect of so large an increase to his dilapidated fortunes was eagerly favoured by the reckless despot, and assenting to the cruel scheme, he placed his signet ring in the hands of Haman, who quickly saw that a decree was issued for the wholesale destruction of the Jewish exiles throughout the Persian dominions without regard to sex or age. Esther 3 verses 8 to 15. News of what was designed before long reached the ears of Mordecai. Knowing that he himself was the main cause of this bloodthirsty decree, he was filled with the utmost alarm and sat down arrayed in sackcloth and ashes at the king's gate. His strange conduct being reported to Esther, she sent to her relative to ascertain the cause, and then for the first time learnt the contents of Haman's edict. In this awful crisis, she resolved to put her life in her hand and to intercede with the king in behalf of her people. Meanwhile, at her suggestion, all the Jews at Susa maintained for 3 days a solemn fast, and then, arrayed in her royal apparel and radiant in her beauty, she presented herself before the king. The captivated monarch stretched forth the golden sceptre and invited her to prefer her petition. "Let the king and Haman," she begged, "come to a banquet of wine." They came, but declining to make known her petition for the present, she invited the two to a similar feast on the following day. Esther 5 and verse 8. Overjoyed at these special marks of honour, Haman eagerly recounted them to his wife and family, but declared that they availed him nothing so long as his rival was permitted to retain his place at the king's gate. They therefore advised that a gallows of 50 cubits high should be erected, and that he should request the king's permission to hang Mordecai thereon. But that night the monarch, unable to sleep, ordered certain of the chronicles to be read before him, and now for the first time learnt the service the Jewish exile had rendered by revealing the plot against his own life. In answer to his inquiries, he had just ascertained that no mark of the royal approval had been bestowed upon his benefactor when Haman entered the court in the early morning to request that execution might be carried out upon his hated rival. The king inquired what ought to be done to the man he delighted to honour. Imagining that none but himself could be intended, the favourite suggested that he should be clad in royal apparel, crowned with the king's diadem, and mounted on the royal mule, be conducted through the streets of Susa by one of the king's most noble friends. The monarch approved, and bade him straightway confer all these marks of honour on no other than Mordecai. Not daring to disobey, he arrayed his rival in the gorgeous robes of the king and conducted him through the streets of the city. Then, with a heavy heart, he returned home and recounted to his family the strange events of the day. A presentiment of coming doom came over his relatives, but a hasty summons to the royal banquet cut short their deliberations. For the second time, the monarch desired to learn the queen's petition, and Esther now revealed the danger of her nation and denounced the wicked conspirator. Filled with wrath, Ahasuerus ordered his instant execution, and at the suggestion of one of the eunuchs, he was hanged on the very gallows he had constructed for his rival. Esther 7 verses 7 through 10. But the execution of Haman was but a step in Mordecai's designs for the delivery of his nation. The edict for the massacre was still in force, and couriers had already gone forth with it to the various provinces of the empire. Its revocation was forbidden by Persian law, but a second edict empowered the Jews to assume the defensive against their adversaries, of whom, banding themselves together, they slew 800 at Susa, Esther 9 verses 6 and 15, and 75,000 in the various provinces, while Haman's 10 sons shared their father's fate. Esther 9 verses 12 and 16. In memory of this signal deliverance, the Jews to this day celebrate the Feast of Purim or Lots, in ironical commemoration of their great enemy, who had resorted to this mode of augury for ascertaining an auspicious day for executing his bloody design against their nation. Preceded by a strict fast on the 13th of Adar, the festival is celebrated on the 14th and 15th with great rejoicings. According to modern usage, the book of Esther is read in the synagogue, And when the reader comes to the name of Haman, the entire assembly shout, "Let his name be blotted out. Let the name of the ungodly perish." And the conclusion of the service is followed by feasting and merriment. End of Book 11, Chapter 3, recorded by Cliff Stone of Sydney, Australia.
Book 11, Chapter 4 of a Class Book of Old Testament History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. A Class Book of Old Testament History by George Frederick Maclear. Book 11, Chapter 4. Times of Ezra and Nehemiah, close of the Canon. Ezra 7-10, Nehemiah 1-8, B.C. 457-415. In the year B.C. 464, Artaxerxes Longimanus succeeded to the Persian throne. His reign was favorable to the Jews, and was signalized B.C. 458 by a fresh migration to Jerusalem, headed by Ezra, a descendant of Hilkiah, the high priest, in the time of Josiah. A royal ordinance empowered him not only to receive contributions from his own nation scattered throughout Babylonia for the adornment of the temple at Jerusalem, but also to establish magistrates and judges throughout all Judea, and to claim assistance from the various pashas of the provinces through which he would pass. Ezra 7:11-26. Thus aided and encouraged, Ezra persuaded about 6,000 of his countrymen to take part in this second migration, amongst whom were many of the priesthood, both of the higher and lower orders. After a fast of 3 days at the river Ahava, to supplicate the divine blessing on the enterprise, the expedition set out, and though not escorted by a royal guard, reached Jerusalem in safety. Ezra 8:32. Ezra was well received by the Jewish governors, but was pained to find much to blame in the conduct of his countrymen. Forgetful of the commands of the law, they had in many instances intermarried with the surrounding heathen tribes. He therefore devoted himself with all zeal to the correction of these abuses, proclaimed a fast by way of atonement for past transgressions, and succeeded in inducing many to put away their strange wives. At the same time, he commenced a more complete reorganization of the people according to the Mosaic law and the institutes of David, and, it is not improbable, a revision and rearrangement of the sacred books. Ezra 10:1-17. But though the Persian monarchs had not been unwilling to render aid in the rebuilding of the Jewish temple, their policy had hitherto forbidden the re-erection of the city itself, which still lay exposed and defenseless, its walls broken down and its gates burned with fire. Nehemiah 1:3. The temple and a few private dwellings being the sole result of 80 years of effort. In the 20th year, however, of Artaxerxes, or B.C. 444, there arrived at Shushan a deputation from Jerusalem, with a sad account of the condition of the city, which they laid before Nehemiah, a Jew, probably of the tribe of Judah, who held a high position amongst the royal cupbearers. Nehemiah instantly conceived the patriotic design of quitting the comforts of his present position and aiding his countrymen in their difficulties. With fasting and prayer he sought the blessing of the Most High on his design, and shortly afterwards, in reply to the inquiries of the king why his countenance was so sad, poured forth the deep desire of his heart, and begged that he might be allowed to go to Judea and rebuild the city of his fathers. Artaxerxes consented, on condition that he return within a certain period of time, and having appointed him Tirshatha, or governor of Judea, gave him letters to the pashas of the provinces through which he would pass, and also to Asaph, the keeper of the royal forests, directing him to supply timber and other necessaries for the work. Nehemiah 2:1-8. Thus empowered and guarded by a troop of cavalry, Nehemiah set out on his journey. On his arrival at Jerusalem, he for 3 days kept silence as to his intentions, but after a midnight survey of the ruined condition of the city, openly proclaimed the purport of his visit, and the royal commission under which he was acting. He advised the instant rebuilding of the city walls, till which was done the colony could not but be a reproach to the surrounding tribes, with their city almost deserted and the temple itself falling into decay. Nehemiah 2:12-20. His project was received with acclamation, and a resolution was formed to press on with the work without delay. But the coming of the new governor had reached the ears of the Samaritans, and Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem an Arabian employed every artifice to defeat his designs. Nehemiah, however, was not to be daunted. His object was to finish the walls in the shortest possible time, and he therefore directed that while one half of the people wrought at the work, the other should stand by armed and ready to defend them, and that the workmen should hold in one hand a weapon and in the other their tools. Thus, by dint of incredible exertions, within the brief space of 52 days, Jerusalem was again girded and enclosed, the walls were rebuilt, the ancient towers set up, and the gateways were ready for the doors to be swung upon them. Nehemiah 4:13-23. Unable to impede by open violence the progress of the enterprise, Sanballat and his friends resorted to various stratagems to get Nehemiah out of the city. They began by proposing a conference with the governor in one of the villages of the plain of Ono in Benjamin. 4 times was the proposition made, and as often declined. Then resort was had to still a more cunning artifice. Sanballat sent to Nehemiah an apparently friendly letter, announcing the prevalence of a rumor among the heathen nations settled in Samaria that he intended Jerusalem to become the capital of an independent kingdom, and had suborned prophets to prophesy of himself. There is a king in Judah. Such rumors were sure to reach the Persian court, but might be dissipated by a friendly conference. At the same time, Noadiah, a prophetess, and others were bribed to represent to the governor the risk he was running, and to persuade him to take refuge in the fortress of the temple. But Nehemiah saw through their designs, and refused to give them any pretext for accusing him of conscious guilt. Nehemiah 6:1-14. In addition to these plots, the governor had to be on his guard against treachery within the city itself, where many of the Jewish nobles were carrying on a secret correspondence with Tobiah, and even espoused his cause. But in spite of all obstacles, the work went on, and the essential part of the governor's design, the building of the gates, was accomplished. Having thus provided for the external security of the city, Nehemiah applied himself with equal zeal to the correction of internal abuses. One of these was the high rate of usury, which those who had any money at their command exacted from their poorer brethren. To such an extent was this the case, that some mortgaged their fields, vineyards, and houses. Others sold or pledged the freedom of their children, while many borrowed at the most exorbitant rates sufficient to pay the royal taxes. Nehemiah 5:1-14. The discovery of this nefarious system roused the governor's indignation. Himself noble, generous, and high-minded, he declined even the usual supplies for his own table which former governors had received, defrayed many expenses out of his own purse, and even entertained the poorer classes of the countrymen at his own table. Nehemiah 5:14-19. With righteous sternness, therefore, he rebuked the nobles who connived at this disgraceful traffic, and convoking an assembly demanded that his enslaved countrymen should be set free, their debts remitted, and the enormous interest foregone. His rebukes had their effect. The assembly unanimously announced their willingness to accede to his demands, and abstain from such conduct in the future. Other measures for the internal welfare of the city were then proceeded with. The doors having been set up in the gates, the custody of the city was committed to Hanani, a relative of the governor. A register of the people was taken. The law was solemnly read in their hearing by Ezra. Nehemiah 8:1-16. And the Feast of Tabernacles was celebrated with due solemnities from the 15th to the 22nd of the month, Tisri. 2 days afterwards a fast was proclaimed, and the people made a formal confession of their national sins, and enumerated the gracious dealings of the Most High with them, from the call of Abraham to the return from the captivity. Nehemiah 9, 6-37. At the same time they ratified a solemn covenant to serve the Lord with all their heart, and keep the ordinances of the Lord, to avoid intermarriages with heathens, to observe the Sabbaths and other holy days, and neither buy nor sell goods thereon, to keep the 7th or sabbatical year, and remit all debts during it, to contribute each man 1/3 of a shekel towards the support of the temple service, and to maintain the customary first fruits and tithes. Nehemiah 29-39. Having, in cooperation with Ezra, thus restored the national institutions, Nehemiah returned to the Persian court, B.C. 432. During his absence, the old abuses again began to creep in. The people contracted alliances with foreigners, neglected the Sabbath, and forgot the covenant they had so lately sworn to observe. As soon as he was informed of this, Nehemiah sought and obtained permission to revisit once more the scene of his former labors. And as Tirshatha was invested with renewed powers. Returning after an absence of about 9 years, he found that Eliashib, the high priest, had permitted Tobiah, the Ammonite, to occupy a large chamber in the temple, which had before been used as a store for the frankincense, the holy vessels, and the tithes of corn, wine, and oil. Thereupon he insisted on the expulsion of the intruder, and the restoration of the ejected vessels and stores, over which he appointed a Levitical guard. Nehemiah 13, 1-15. He next introduced measures for the prevention of traffic on the day of rest, and the celebration of mixed marriages, alike amongst the lower and the higher orders of the people, even deposing from his sacred functions the high priest Eliashib, for permitting his son Joiada to ally himself with a daughter of Sanballat the Horonite. Nehemiah 13, 15-28. Having thus completed his second administration, this truly patriotic and upright governor in all probability returned to Persia about B.C. 413, and there died. With this date closes the history contained in the Scriptures of the Old Testament. While the mass of the Hebrew people was scattered among the nations, carrying with them wherever they went their law and their institutions, we have seen a remnant, as had indeed been foretold, restored to their own land, their holy temple rebuilt, their glorious city raised from its ruins. Very different indeed was their position now from that which the nation had occupied during the palmy days of Solomon, when their kingdom stretched from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, from the mountains of Lebanon to the Red Sea. Different, too, and far less costly was their temple in comparison with that which the artisans of Hiram had built for the son of David. But in its moral and spiritual condition, the remnant of the nation far excelled the contemporaries of its greatest king. In the furnace of affliction, it had been thoroughly purified from all tendencies to idolatry. The dreary years, when their harps hung upon the willows by the waters of Babylon, had not been without their salutary effect upon the people. There was no division now in the objects of their worship. No high places were to be seen crowned with temples dedicated to Baal or Shamash. No groves screened with their leafy covert the impure orgies of Ashtaroth. No drums and cymbals drowned with their horrid clang the wail of infants in the valley of Ben Hinnom, as they were passed through the fire to appease the cruel Moloch. These oracles were dumb. The Jew was no longer an idolater. The divine unity was now the central truth of his creed. The law once neglected was now read, copied, studied. While Nehemiah had earnestly applied himself to the civil administration, Ezra and others after him, with no less zeal, devoted their energies to collecting, transcribing, arranging the sacred books. These were ultimately classed under 3 divisions. 1. The Law, containing the 5 books of Moses. 2. The Prophets, which included the historical and prophetical writings. 3. The Psalms or Hagiographa, sacred writings, comprising the poetical books. Meanwhile, varied as had been the fortunes of the chosen people, The assurance of a Savior, of God's purpose of love in the promised seed, had never been forgotten. As first made known to man in paradise, it did perhaps, as we have seen, little more than assure him of a future interposition in his behalf, without informing him whether his Redeemer should be one or many, the collective race or a single deliverer. But once again, the realization of the promise becomes the goal of sacred history. Through one of the sons of Noah, it is limited to a particular race; through the call of Abraham, to a particular nation; through Judah, to a particular tribe. When the people flee away from the terrors of Sinai, Moses predicts the coming of a greater prophet and a mightier mediator. When the scepter rises from Judah and David sits upon his throne, he himself speaks of a greater king, of one he calls his Lord, who shall sit upon his throne, and of whose kingdom there shall be no end. When the mournful close of Solomon's reign proves that he could not be the destined king, when his kingdom was rent in twain, and his subjects become a prey to their enemies, and are carried off into far distant lands, even then the very sadness of the captivity only serves to correct the idea of the Messiah, and the Son of David gives place to the writings of Daniel to the Son of Man. Thus each crisis of the nation's history serves to bring the promise within narrower limits and to illustrate it with fresh details. Meanwhile, as time rolls on, and one prophet after another brings out some new particular foreshadowing the birthplace, or the offices, or the works of the Messiah, another voice begins to be heard in the temple of prophecy. It is not jubilant and glad, telling of triumph and of glory, of the subjugation of nations, or the setting up of a kingdom. It is subdued and mournful. It whispers of suffering and rejection, of a triumph indeed, but not the triumph of an earthly conqueror. It speaks of the coming of a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, of his being wounded for our transgressions and bruised for iniquities, of his being cut off, but not for himself. The earliest prophecy had declared that the seed of the woman should bruise the serpent's head, but had whispered that the serpent would bruise his heel. The latest declared that the Messiah should triumph, but also that he should die. Thus, gradually but harmoniously, was the person and work of man's Redeemer unfolded. And at length, in the fullness of time, a babe was born in Bethlehem and laid in a manger. Seed of the woman, of the race of Shem, of the descendants of Abraham, of the tribe of Judah, of the lineage of David. He lived, he died, he rose again. Prophet like unto, but infinitely greater than Moses, he gave us a law which shall never pass away. Priest like unto, but not as Aaron, compassed about with infirmity, he offered up on the altar of his cross a full, perfect, and sufficient sacrifice, atonement and satisfaction for the sins of the whole world. King like unto, but infinitely higher than David, he sitteth at the right hand of God, clad in the glorified nature of the race he came to save, the predicted Redeemer of the Old, the revealed Deliverer of the New Testament, in whom there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither male nor female, neither bond nor free. End of Book 11, Chapter 4. End of a Class Book of Old Testament History by George Frederick Maclear.